Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. Today we have with us Professor Radhika Desai. Professor Desai is professor at the Department of Political Studies and Director Geopolitical Economy Research Group, University of Manitoba. Professor Desai, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Great to be here, Jyotishman.
I wanted to start with what we have been hearing from a lot of circles on the question of global convergence. Obviously, China is a big story, but there are other countries, economies that are also often talked about. Some people are talking about rise of Asia, others are talking about multilateralism. How do you see these ongoing discussions on global convergence?
Well, I think there are at least three different elements to it that I would like to talk about. So I would say that the first instance when this talk became really prolific was in the early 2010s. You know, we just had the 2008 financial crisis. There was a big attempt to respond to it with energetic government sort of intervention. But in reality, you know, you remember the G20 meeting when all these promises were made, but then actually, as it turned out, the interventions turned out to be very weak and insufficient, and the West became mired in a long period of even slower growth than had been experienced in the first decade of the 21st century. So at that point, what happened is people began to talk about multipolarity. And a part of the idea of multipolarity is that the West is losing its dominance because other countries, the developing countries, are growing much faster. And of course, you will remember that this idea actually dates back to the turn of the century when Jim O'Neill of Goldman Sachs coined the term BRICS and suggested that at that time, it was just four countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, that these four countries as sort of leading dynamic countries of the developing world were developing much faster, and that in time, not in the not too distant future, their economic weight in the world economy would amount to something much bigger than the West, and so on. So these ideas were already around, and you have to remember that at that time, partly because of the commodity boom in Russia and Brazil, and because we had a relatively benign government in New Delhi in the form of the UPA government, which under left pressure created the MNREGA, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which did substantially improve the prospects for investment in India and did lead to India to have a reasonably good decade or so of growth. Also, of course, buoyed by commodities boom and so on. But whatever, I mean, it was a generally expansionary decade and all these countries benefited. But at the same time, even then, even in the early 2010s, it was very clear that China was always in a class apart. And so that's the first point. The second point then I would make is that over the last decade and a half, so say since the financial crisis, with the evaporation of the commodities boom, etc., what we now have is China continues to power on at relatively high rates of growth. No matter, you know, the West is of course full of press about the doom and gloom surrounding the Chinese economy, but they have predicted the death of the Chinese economy now for more than 2 decades, and nothing has happened. And we can discuss some of the main elements of that later. But China continues to power along. But thanks to the mismanagement of economies, particularly in India and Brazil, and particularly in the Modi era and the Bolsonaro era, these countries, of course, have performed in the period since much less well. So, you know, after the UPA, you had the Modi era, and the Modi era has been absolutely disastrous for India. And this is not the least reason for the humiliation of Narendra Modi in the last election. Even though he won the election, most would agree that he has suffered a personal defeat of a very great magnitude. But again, we can come back to that later. And Russia was also, by the way, languishing. And in all three cases, the reason was very simple. In contrast to China, which in some ways was committed to some kind of broadly developmentalist framework, I would say even a socialist framework in which the power of capital, which certainly does exist in China, was subordinated to the power of the party state. In the cases of India, Russia, Brazil, what you had was the opposite. Essentially, these countries implemented more or less neoliberal policies. They were not completely neoliberal. In no country do you find pure neoliberalism anyway, and in many cases, there were good reasons to keep a substantial amount of state intervention, but nevertheless, they were neoliberal in the sense that they were increasingly favoring capital and favoring bigger and bigger capital. And this meant that the growth of these countries was not as fast as that of China. And in the last decade and a half, I would say that in these countries, particularly in the case of India, we are looking at a level of harm done to the economy, which is unprecedented. It is unbelievable, and it is heartrending if you think about things like, the suffering imposed on India, not just through the actual economic policies, which are so pro-corporate, but also through completely unnecessary disasters imposed, like demonetization, like GST, like, of course, the response to COVID, which was so completely ramshackle and literally like a kind of malign form of incompetence, that what you saw. So as a consequence, the non-Chinese BRICS have fallen even further behind. So that's the second point I'd like to make. But the third point is perhaps equally important. Like, while I will be the first to join the line of the critics of Indian economic policy, particularly under Modi, but I will also criticize many shortcomings of UPA, etc. A lot more could have been done to make the Indian economy a lot more dynamic, and was not done, chiefly because the Congress party at that time felt so beholden, and let me rephrase that, the Congress party at that time was so desirous of being the party of choice of big capital in India, and so it was bending over backwards to do what they wanted. Anyway, so I will be first to criticize these countries, but there is another element to this talk of convergence which we must understand, and that is that Western countries are losing their centrality to the world system. This is definitely happening, and I would say it has been happening for a long time. To me, I would say two things in this respect. In my book, 2013 book, Geopolitical Economy, I argue that the world had already become multipolar in the late 19th century, when countries like the United States, Germany, and later Japan all emerged, industrialized, and essentially ate into Britain's dominance over the world market. So from a unipolarity, which was merely natural in the sense that Britain was the first to industrialize, for a time it was bound to dominate the world economy, and it did dominate the world economy. But what I call the combined development industrialization, that is to say the state-led industrialization of all these other countries, already had created multiple centers of accumulation around the world. And over the century and a half that has followed, we have only seen the further spread of productive power, not through the spread of markets, but through the successful pursuit of state-led industrialization. So the world has become all the more multipolar since then. So in that sense, I would say that 1914, when these late industrializers so also became imperialists and essentially covered the whole world, brought the whole world under the imperial control of one or the other of these the small club of essentially Western countries plus Japan. This period culminated in 1914, and that point was the peak of imperialism. Since then, imperialism has declined, not as fast as you and I might want, but definitely, and not completely without reversals. You might say the 1980s, when structural adjustment was imposed on so much of the world, was an instance when there was a big reversal, and many people talked about the recolonization of the world and so on. So yes, there were setbacks as well, but on the whole, the trend has been towards the loss of power of the West. And I would say that trend is continuing for no other reason than that and this is another argument that I would make maybe later on, is that um, capitalism, really, it is today clearer than ever, and it should have been clearer a lot earlier, but today, definitely at the end of 40 plus years of neoliberalism, it is clear than ever that capitalism is long past its sell-by date, that it can only become ever more senile, ever less productive, ever more financial, ever more unequal, and ever more dangerous, and prone to war. So all of these things are true. So capitalism itself is incapable of pursuing growth. So if any of these countries wishes to see a renewal of growth, they're going to have to fundamentally rethink a lot of things. And so because of that, that's sort of point 3A. And then point 3B is that you see a lot of people today are arguing, that the US is losing its hegemony, etc. But I also argue in geopolitical economy that precisely because the world had already become multipolar in the late 19th century, the United States had the misfortune of wishing to replace Britain as the sort of ruling power in the world, what at that time they called it the managing segment of the world economy. The US had the misfortune of acquiring the aspiration to achieve this purpose precisely when the achievement of this purpose was no longer possible, because there were already too many centers. And of course, in the course of the further evolution, I say 1914 was the peak of imperialism. Another reason why 1914 is the peak of imperialism is that it obviously it sets off 1914 is the beginning of the First World War and the 30 years crisis of 1914 to 1945. And think about what happens at the beginning and at the end of the 30 years crisis. You have at the beginning the Russian Revolution and at the end the Chinese Revolution. And these two revolutions are also massive eruptions that show that for much of the rest of the world, development cannot happen in any kind of simple replication of the processes that occurred in the imperialist countries, simply because they are not imperialist countries. They have to find new paths of development. And so they also then the enormous exertions of the Russians, which had, I think, by the 1930s, Russia, I think, had become the second or third, probably the second most powerful manufacturing country in the world at this point, which is very important to note. So these developments also contributed to making the world multipolar. In the 1950s and 60s, we talked about bipolarity right up until the end of the Cold War. So the US never succeeded in singly dominating the world economy. So that's another thing. So essentially, what I'm trying to say is that the third thing that is important to note about this talk about convergence is that it is being conducted on the part of those who are arguing that, and often for very good reasons, arguing that the United States has lost its dominance, that it is impossible that it can recreate this dominance, and therefore it should stop trying to do so, because efforts at creating that sort of dominance is harming both the US economy and, of course, generating war and chaos in the rest of the world.
I think one of the strands I wanted to pick up on this is most often in this discussion, the manufacturing or output data are given as the sort of testimony to rise of the global south. The classic data would be like by 1994, probably the BRICS plus country contributed to like 18 to 19% in terms of overall output, while the G7 countries would contribute about 45%. And by now, things have been to some extent reversed, although not exactly reversed. Today, probably like 35% would be like BRICS plus, and 29 to 30% would be G7. And that is presented as the sort of decline of the West. I think my problem with that is that it doesn't take into account the decline of manufacturing itself. So by 1980s, like finance was much smaller, like overall, capital markets was probably equivalent to the global GDP. Today it's probably 4 times. So if you look at the Fortune 500 companies, for instance, I went through the data. Last year, total profit was like $2.9 trillion. And out of it, the US companies had $1.1 trillion. Chinese companies overtake US in terms of number, but total profit was like 500 something billion. And that's China only, the very important point that you made, that China is a little bit of outlier, which is, of course, true. In the aggregate picture of Fortune 500 companies, it's Europe, US, and China. There is no other economy. So that's my sort of skepticism, apart from the sort of per capita thing, which is obviously, like, even China is very much, sort of middle income, 21 22,000 per capita. Brazil has, it seems like it has been trapped in middle income for a very long time. India is not even middle income, and so on. So I am a little bit skeptical about this sort of overt optimism on part of certain sections of the left whose political values and ethical values I share. And I also see the reason why they do that, because there is a panic and hysteria in the more sort of imperialist core about rise of China, rise of Asia, because they just can't imagine not dominating the world. But I am a little bit skeptical about uh, this manufacturing data being quoted, because I don't think it's as relevant in terms of dominating the world when finance is the supreme element of capitalism.
Okay, so several different things. First of all, the data that are used are data about GDP, not manufacturing. So GDP includes all sectors. It doesn't just include agriculture, it includes manufacturing, it includes mining, it includes services, everything is included, and finance is included as well. So, and these are the data that are used, but there is still something wrong with the data. What is that? In most cases where people talk about convergence, they are using data for something called PPP, purchasing power parity. So do you want me to explain a little bit what purchasing power parity is, or do you think, shall we assume everybody understands?
I think people understand it.
Okay, then I will. So purchasing power parity, which really essentially the overall effect of purchasing power parity is to inflate the income of poor countries where the cost of labor is lower and depress the income of rich countries where the cost of labor is higher. So very briefly. So then that tends to, of course, exaggerate the convergence, right? And that is itself problematic. However, so that's that is a point which would agree with your point that the convergence is exaggerated. But then, if we consider something else, which is manufacturing per se, what we are looking at is a very profound deindustrialization of the core neoliberal countries, particularly the US and the UK. Although now that same level of deindustrialization, or let me rephrase that, now with particularly in the aftermath of the Ukraine crisis, but even going back before then, going back to the creation of the Eurozone, which was accompanied by a considerable financialization of the European economy, and well, to a lesser extent, Japan. Japan still remains a big manufacturing powerhouse, but nevertheless, I would say that the deindustrialization of these countries is not sufficiently taken into account, which means that the United States economy is far weaker than the data suggests. So in that sense, that would go against your point about convergence, because a lot of the GDP in the United States comes from services. And without a base of manufacturing, you can't even have good services. So you need manufacturing to have that. But finally, I would say that there is a further problem which exaggerates the size of the US economy, and that is to use the title of the book of somebody I know very well, and he's done a lot of excellent work on this. He talks about, Jacob Asser talks about the financialization of GDP. So he shows that particularly in the case of the United States, the way in which GDP is measured has been changed over the decades in such a way that the financial activities, which would have previously been considered a cost, are now considered to be producing value, producing goods and services, and therefore they inflate the size of GDP. And more generally, the more the more there is financial activity in any economy, the more it tends to squeeze essentially a manufacturing activity. And so the United States economy today really represents the absurd ability of a small section, a small sliver of American financial elites to appropriate other people's income, both within the United States and in the rest of the world, through financial means without producing anything. So it actually does not convey the exact extent to which the US economy has been weakened. And to a similar extent, I would say that the same goes for the UK. And so in both of these countries, you have seen extreme forms of financialization, and that tends to exaggerate their economic strength. You know, when you just look at GDP figures, because these GDP figures are already overly financialized. And then, so for all these reasons, I would say that the convergence thesis is not completely wrong. I will agree with you, however, as I think should be clear from our conversation so far, that the real story is much more complex. And really, to me, it was much more a story of the decline of the capitalist West, because of the neoliberal capitalism. But I also argue that no other form of capitalism is possible anymore. If they wish to overcome the ills of neoliberalism in Western countries, they have to abandon capitalism in a serious way, and we can discuss what forms it can take. And the ability of China as a meaningfully socialist economy to continue to develop. And of course, what we've also seen in China is, you know, for a while, especially from the mid-90s to the mid-2000s, it looked as though Chinese growth was heavily reliant on exports. But today, more and more, China is developing using its own domestic market as a stimulus, particularly given that Western countries are not really able to provide much of a market anyway. And I think that makes China's growth much more sustainable and better, of a better quality. So that's also very important.
Yeah, I want to shift to neoliberalism itself, but just one last sort of intervention. I think the divergence in terms of GDP is not very clear, and that's precisely because the contribution of the financial sector is taken into account within GDP calculation. I think the more clear trends of the convergence are within manufacturing, and that's where the sort of this kind of naive optimism comes from. Because if you look at GDP data, then the US is significantly growing even today. Like it has now almost, it's reaching closer to 80,000 in PPP terms. It's a huge lead. I mean, surely Europe and Japan and others have fallen behind the, US. Um, so, I mean, if you look at the sort of where profits are coming from now, it's the sort of energy sector, finance sector, and tech sector. They combined almost 65% of overall profit. You add the health sector and transportation, that's 75%. So really, if you are looking at the apparel or chemicals, fertilizers, even metals, the sort of traditional manufacturing powerhouse, individual sectors are even less than 1% of overall profit and investment. So I agree that, and this is something we will discuss on our next question, the impact of this deindustrialization, impact of neoliberalism on individual countries. But if we are talking about the aggregate power, then why is manufacturing so important? Because they are dominating through this sort of, financial transformation. The US companies are still dominating. global
I mean,
capital?
that's a very complex question. So first of all, let me say that the US may be dominating, but more and more the ability of Western financial companies to continue to profit from economic activities going on elsewhere is shrinking as more and more countries, well, particularly countries like China, but more countries should prevent them from doing so, but they do not, for reasons that we were discussing earlier, that their governments do not pursue the right economic policies. Because essentially, if you had regulations like capital controls, if you had regulations on the extent to which foreign financial companies could invest in your economy, etc., then the countries all over the world, in developing countries, but even countries of Europe, would not be allowing so much of the value that they are creating to be siphoned off by big American corporations. And I would say that this is a change that will come, because at this point, we are already looking at at all these countries are in a crisis. They are in a crisis in which ordinary people are hurting. They are wanting some kind of some kind of political alternative, with the left having been essentially destroyed over the neoliberal decades. The only alternative they are being offered are alternatives to the right. So
We
in
had the election to European Parliament with
Well, exactly. So look at the elections to the European Parliament, but also, Trump is still in the lead. In Europe, in Britain, people are saying, "Ho hum, what's there's nothing important about the UK elections," simply because Keir Starmer is practically indistinguishable from Rishi Sunak. So what's the point? Is there do the British people even have a choice? I mean, every day there is some new further disappointment that is conveyed by the Labour Party, that it is not going to undertake this measure or that measure that was supposed to, at least in some minimal way, progressive, and they are abandoning them right, left, and center. So they are becoming indistinguishable. So in all these ways, we are looking at a deep popular desire for alternatives, which is only being fulfilled by parties of the right. So these countries are in deep mess. Now, and this is because of deindustrialization. That is why Trump is making headway. Trump is talking about industry. Trump is saying he's not talking about the real cause. Instead of saying that to American voters, the reason why you are suffering today is 40 plus years of neoliberal policy. He's not going to say that. He is himself a tycoon. He is connected with tycoons. He would like to be more connected with tycoons. So he's not going to say that. But he's saying, oh, China is your problem, etc. Now, what has
also the
happened with
European Union.
European Union? Less so. I mean, it's mostly China, but yes, okay, to the extent that there is some of this.
No, I was saying that the sort of blame game on China,
Is
protectionism
also
and
the
stuff is
EU is
rise on
also conducting that. Yes, okay, I suppose, but to a lesser extent, I think I would say that the extent to which this has gone crazy in the United States is much greater, and I think that the Europe really faces a choice between having trade relations with China versus the US. And Europe still has enough technologically sophisticated goods to offer to China, whereas the US has relatively little, if you ask me. And this is also one of the remarkable things, because, what neoliberalism to me is not about markets. It's not about offering people it's not about creating competition and markets and so on. It's really about favoring big companies. And the United States has favored big companies for the last 40 plus years. What is the result? They are unable to stay at the head of the technological head, which is why the new Cold War with China is taking on such a technological character, about China's ability to produce high-tech goods, whether it's in ecology or in terms of chips and what have you. The US is not going to try. The US is trying to hang on to static technological advantage. It doesn't understand that in order to retain technological advantage in the long run, you have to keep on innovating. It's not a static thing. So the way to stay on top is not to prevent others from catching up with you in technology, but in fact to continue innovating, which is what important truth. And so what you've got in the United States is massive deindustrialization, precisely the transfer of all those manufacturing jobs of the sort that you talked about, whether it's making cars or textiles or what have you. They've all been lost. And a small number of sectors now dominate the US economy. You mentioned some. Energy and generally mining or extractive sector, the tech sector, the health sector, which I consider part of the tech sector, or the financial sector, because it depends on which side of health you're looking at, the military industrial complex, and fire in or finance, insurance, and real estate. These are the sectors that dominate. Bulk of them are not involved in any kind of big time manufacturing, or if they are, they employ a very small number of people in relatively high tech manufacturing whose supply chains are spread around the world and are particularly concentrated in China, which is so in that sense, you were talking about you are finding that in terms of the convergence thesis, that manufacturing is not being looked at. I think what you have seen as part of the larger decline of imperial power and the larger decline of capitalism is that in the homelands of neoliberal capitalism, essentially, companies have been given so much freedom that they have essentially stopped manufacturing much of note in these homelands and outsourced manufacturing. Remember, it's also outsourcing. Outsourcing is not the same as foreign direct investment. And outsourcing, which involves, which, for example, if a company is outsourcing versus engaging in FDI, if your company is engaging in FDI, it is actually taking capital and technology, etc., to some foreign country and creating new productive capacities there. If it is outsourcing, it is actually asking somebody else to make the investment and even come up with the skills and the know-how and all those things, but to deliver certain products of certain type on a regular basis to you, etc. So this was, and why is this a bad idea? Why is becoming dependent? This became very apparent during the pandemic when supply chain disruptions led to a disruption of supply, and disruption of supply immediately fed into inflation. And by the way, I would argue that today, as also in the 1970s, the return of inflation is a very important mark of the declining imperial power of the core countries of the world, because they can no longer compel the rest of the world to yield up their goods and services, their primary products at prices that they can afford. So they are facing inflation. Now, just one more point, and then I'll stop and we'll move on to the next question. But part of this is actually a result of the fact that production itself is being squeezed in the developing countries. Partly because, like we were saying earlier, in countries like Brazil and India and South Africa, economic policies have not been developmentalist. They have not expanded productive capacity. They have not expanded markets. And this is actually a big indictment of these countries. And as a result, what we are looking at is far slower growth in the expansion of production, whether it is in agriculture or manufacturing. And this is also contributing to inflation, because if you are essentially following policies that are squeezing farmers out, that are destroying what little manufacturing is taking place in your economy, you're going to get shortfalls in production, and that cannot but be directly inflationary, both in your country and abroad.
Yeah, there has been huge outrage within the financial class about the interest rates. I mean, they're expecting the interest rates to be cut over and over again. I think the European Central Bank cut it after 5 years for the first time, but from the Fed there are very little signs, and also the sort of May data of 272,000 new jobs, although unemployment still remains at 4%. Very little chance of Fed cut. I'm glad you also mentioned about the agriculture sector. We don't want to discuss, but just for the record, because there seems to have also a negative movement of terms of trade against agriculture since maybe the 1990s, which has affected massively, the global South, and also on the inflation side, there is the rise of sort of speculators within the commodity market, which means that there is a huge difference between the retail price and what the wholesale price that the farmers are getting, which is a sort of, not just in India and elsewhere, but even in France, where small commodity producers are there. They are even in Germany, they are talking about things like minimum support prices. I want to You have talked a lot about neoliberalism already, so I would just ask you to summarize for us how you understand neoliberalism, and probably just flag a couple of key, like, big points that strike you, and then we can move forward.
Yeah, so in fact, the last point you made about agriculture and how you are talking about minimum support prices, even in countries like Europe, this is a very good example, or this is a good way of explaining what neoliberalism means. In the theory, we are told that neoliberalism is about free markets. But in reality, it could not be about free markets and competition, because for one very simple reason. Already in the early 20th century, capitalism in its major homelands had already entered the monopoly phase. So when you already have this type of capitalism, remember, a post-war period, there were entire schools of Marxists and even many others talking about monopoly capitalism and so on. And so this was the kind of capitalism you had. And it did not, and once capital has arrived at a monopoly phase, you can't suddenly just turn the clock back. You can't say, it's a bit like saying, while you have the capacity to produce bulldozers, that we are no longer going to construct with bulldozers or dig holes with bulldozers, we are going to dig it with shovels and spades. No, this is not possible. It's not going to work. So really, Marx had already said that if you read volume 3, Marx says very clearly in it that once the monopoly phase arrives, capitalism is finished. It's past its sell-by date. And people will realize that, and they will essentially say, okay, production on a big scale has made possible these monopolies. Of course, monopolies are also made possible in some other ways, not so good ways, but nevertheless, now that you have these monopolies, and that's what production requires, production on a large scale, they should simply be taken into public ownership. There is no two ways about it. Why should a monopolist be allowed to abuse their monopolistic position? It should be a public asset, and we should take advantage of economies of scale rather than trying to roll them back, which is silly. So Marx was very clear about that. And also in the post-Second World War period, you got a relatively benign period of growth, the so-called golden age of growth, because although the world did not become socialist, it definitely took a turn to the left. In advanced countries, you had Keynesian welfare states. You had, in Second World, you had communism. In the Third World, you had national attempts to create national autonomous development. All of them involved a great role for the state, and subjecting capital to certain regulations and certain obligations and so on. And what is neoliberalism? So that was able to create a growth, and it created growth, by the way, by allowing demand to expand. And demand expanded because ordinary working people, whether they were workers or peasants, got a better income during this period on average. And so it also made prospects better for investment and so on and so forth, because why should you invest if there is no demand? So all of these things came true. So to me, the secret of the golden age is not that capitalism won back its mojo, which is what even many Marxists believe, but rather that capitalism, monopoly capitalism, was ringed around by all these socialistic measures. Neoliberalism is essentially when the underlying capitalism led to a crisis, there should have been two alternatives. One alternative, which would have been the correct one, was to say, look, this just shows that we need to deepen the regulation. We need to expand the socialistic role of the state and so on. And that is the way out of this crisis. We need to deepen the socialistic reform of the capitalist system. The option was to say, no, these reforms were the problem. We have to roll them back, free capital so that it will get back its mojo, etc. It was always a lie. If you give if you create market freedoms in a competitive market economy, maybe you would have had, at least for a time, the benign results that were expected by neoliberal theory. But in an economy that is already dominated by big monopoly corporations, all you're going to get is a further concentration of ownership, financialization, because these people are not going to invest. They will want to essentially make a lot of easy money, which is what they have done. We have neoliberalism has gone hand in hand with financialization, and you are going to get increasing aggression abroad because they are going to try to shut down competition elsewhere. So this is what we have seen. So neoliberalism has always been about increasing the power and freedoms, the political power and the political freedoms of big corporations. It's never been about competition and free markets. And this is what we must understand. And this is why it is critically important to throw it out, and therefore along with it, and to realize that no other form of capitalism is today possible. If we want to have a better economic system, a reformed capitalism is not going to get us there, because the kind of reforms we need to make today, which is to subject the biggest centers of capitalist power to the political will, to the people's will. The moment you do that, you are no longer living in capitalism. You are living in a different type of system in which capital exists, maybe even big capital exists, but it is subject to the rule of the people. It is subject to a larger planning mechanism, which will assign it a certain role, which will say either you do this or you are taken over, etc. And that's where we need to go. But there are very few people who are talking about this.
Right there. So in the US, it's not just allowing its own manufacturing base to die. Like neoliberals would have liked it. I mean, Milton Friedman was saying that let manufacturing die here because per unit cost of production are very high. We'd be better off importing stuff, producing in China or elsewhere at a much cheaper rate. But it's not just this sort of Schumpeterian regeneration, but also shifting value to the sphere of finance. And I think that's where the crux lies. It's the relationship between Apple and Foxconn that I often think about. Foxconn employs like 1 million people. Apple employs like maybe 150,000, 200,000. But its valuation is like $3 trillion. Foxconn probably not even $1 trillion. So that kind of tells us, and that's precisely why I was a little bit skeptical about putting in so much emphasis on manufacturing in order to understand capitalism as it is in the current form. I mean, I would like
Yes.
manufacturing to have bigger value, but value has been completely shifted away from manufacturing towards finance.
Okay, but just one clarification, because earlier when you said that, you object, you see, what your position seems to imply that GDP only counts manufacturing and does not count finance. No, it counts manufacturing as well as finance. So
Yeah,
that's
but
the first
GDP
thing.
numbers are not converging. What is in the discussion about convergence? It's mostly either gross value addition or manufacturing sector that is often compared. Because if you're talking GDP per capita, where's the convergence with Brazil, or where's the Brazil has been trapped in middle income
No,
for a
no,
very
again, you must distinguish between GDP. So the GDP of the United States is whatever it is you were saying, sorry, it is like a 20 trillion economy.
right.
And the per capita GDP is whatever it is you were saying, 80,000 or something
Right.
like that.
Big.
Let's just say those figures are correct. So per GDP is GDP, how much does the US produce, how much
Overall.
does India produce, etc. And then per capita GDP is another figure. The convergence people are not saying that per capita GDP is converging. They
Right.
are saying, however, that the total production in the imperialist core is shrinking as a proportion of the whole world economy. And that is an issue because, I remember when I was growing up, we were in India at that point, some 350 million people. And India's economy was still smaller than that of Belgium.
Mhm.
Of Belgium. Now, that reality is going away, right? That India, that the sheer size of India's economy, not talking about per capita income, just talking about how much Indians all put together produce, is at least larger than Belgium and
Yeah,
larger
no,
even
but I
than
mean,
other medium-sized
I
European countries.
understand what you're saying. I mean, you're saying that GDP and GDP per capita, of course, they're different. But what I'm saying is that GDP, there would be some level of convergence in GDP because the base level is so low. So if you say like Indian GDP was very low to begin with, and the advanced economies had already reached a threshold levels of capital formation, they are not going to grow at like 7%, 8%, which from a lower base you can grow, because there is always a diminishing rate of return. I think the sort of optimism and sort of this excitement doesn't come from the fact that there is a greater share of GDP in the overall GDP, because that I think has been happening slowly for some time. The dramatic
No, I mean, okay, I mean,
the
I'll
dramatic
grant
difference is
that,
in
but
manufacturing and GVA, the gross value addition, where you
no,
get
but
the dramatic.
GVA is also counted for non-manufacturing sectors. Agriculture contributes GVA. GVA
Very
is the
low.
same as GDP, actually. If you GDP is designed, I mean, it's not perfect, but it is designed to
GVA is
tag.
the investment sector of the GDP. It represents the overall.
No, not at all. I think there's some confusion, and you can cut out this part
No,
of
no,
the
it
video.
can stay here.
Yeah, but gross value added. So if for a firm, gross value added is whatever it produced in a given year less its costs. Like whatever is sold in a given year less its cost.
Like
That's the value that was
like the
added.
gross value addition in China would be like 42% of GDP. In the US, it would be like 30%, or in India, it
I
would be even
don't
less.
think so. GVA for all Chinese economic activity should equal Chinese GDP.
Okay, let's keep that for fact check. I don't think
Okay.
that's the
Yeah.
definition. But I
Let,
think
let-
regardless of that, my point is that the big excitement comes when you look at the manufacturing data, and that's where I'm trying to
No, but
caution.
if you look at anything, for example, we were just discussing in our emails the Jeffrey Sachs article about comparing and making some of these points. He is not talking about GVA at all. He's talking about GDP figures. He's, as I said, talking about per capita, what is it, purchasing power parity GDP figures, which is problematic. I would say that it tends to exaggerate convergence. Uh, and the only people who are exercised about manufacturing are people like Trump, who, I mean, I'm also exercised about it, but nobody listens to me. But people listen to Trump. So, and I have a very different thing to say than he does. But he's exercised about manufacturing, and he says to Americans, "You are losing good manufacturing jobs, and the reason you are losing good manufacturing jobs is because of those darn Chinese, and that's the issue." Whereas in reality, Americans have been losing good manufacturing jobs because of neoliberal policy, which has increased the ability of American corporations to outsource things rather than produce them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty much we have an agreement. I think the major disagreement, as I understand, um is the sort of calculating values, and from there it stems, I think, a lot of how we see. I mean, even from technological perspective, for instance. I mean, um, you said that the US is declining, but if you look at the number of patents, if you look at even what the Chinese venture capitalists are saying, that it's the Silicon Valley where we want to invest. And there are these recent developments where, the US state has been excluding, the has been prohibiting the Chinese venture capital to invest in firms that are related to secure. I mean, these are rough, I mean, mostly, nonsense that is cooked up, but they are excluded from investing in US firms. They can still hold some minority share, but they can't have majority
Yeah,
share.
but you are assuming that all these things are not only rational, but they are also effective. And I'm
I'm
not
not
sure.
assuming that. I'm saying that capitalism as it exists values that. I don't like it. And from there, they draw the power. So it is just as Apple is more powerful than Foxconn. As long as Apple maintains that
Yes,
asymmetry,
although
it is
yes,
dominating.
now let me come back to that another thing about that as well, which is that to just use market capitalization, particularly in Western financial markets, as the sign of power is not adequate either, because one
Okay.
of the consequences of financialization has been to massively overvalue the companies, the stocks of companies, so that you get a
Right.
completely, I mean, think about it. During the pandemic and since then as well, the economies have been tanking, stock markets have been going in the opposite direction. I mean, that makes absolutely no sense. The price earning ratios are completely out of whack. People are saying that there has to be some kind of market correction, and that the question is when it will come. We don't know, because it's a big complex system in which, as long as you have sufficient number of sufficient number of investors who believe that this is going to be the case, you will keep inflating the market. And there's another reason why the market keeps inflating, and that is that the money, there's so much money that has been created through the Federal Reserve's easy money policy, that there is a lot of money sloshing about in the financial markets, which has nowhere to go but into the stock market. They are desperately looking for some or the other asset in which to invest. So yeah, I
Yeah.
mean,
So
and,
so
and,
so
and so
that
it's completely
that's
absurd,
yeah, yeah.
absurdly high, but yeah.
Yeah, no, that's definitely very, very detrimental to the people at large, and I don't think that we should argue for accepting market valuation as the true value. But what I'm saying is that under capitalism that exists, that's where the power comes from. So if you have big financial assets, you don't need to own a factory. Like maybe in extreme
No,
events,
that is
like
not true, actually. And the United States is
because you can buy a
beginning to.
factory then.
No, 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 no. Hang on. Look, just because some many powerful capitalists think XYZ is the thing to do, outsourcing is the thing to do, it does not mean that they are right about it. It only means that they're going to do it. Then they are going to have to suffer the consequences. This is one element of Marx's understanding, which I would like to bring back in a much bigger way, which is the notion of contradiction. You know, right now, a lot of what the big capitalist countries are doing, and even what big capital is doing, is a bit like a baby throwing a tantrum. It wants everything at once, and it can't have everything at once, and then it is distressed, and then it complains, and so on. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that just because capital does something thinking it'll work, does not mean that it will work. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the Inflation Reduction Act, which is trying to reshore so much production. You wouldn't have, because somewhere the American ruling classes are beginning to be aware that allowing the extent of outsourcing to China that they have allowed over the past so many decades has not been a good idea. But unfortunately, what they will need to do to reverse that is actually curb the power of capital. And it does not look as though either Biden or Trump is willing to do that. And unless you have a government that is willing essentially to rein capital in and to say, okay, now we don't listen to you, you listen to us. Because remember, what is a capitalist country? A capitalist country is one in which the state listens to capital. And in a non-capitalist, a socialist country, capital must listen to the party state. That's the only way. And so you don't have that scenario in the United States yet. There is not a single political force, apart, I say, from people like Jill Stein, who are arguing the correct point, and I would say more power to them. I do what I can to support Jill Stein. And I would say that these are the only forces that are talking about this, because that is what is needed. You are not going to get effective reshoring. You're not even going to get a mildly successful industrial strategy unless you discipline the power of capital. Because consider this, which are the countries which we know have been successful at industrial strategy? Germany, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. In all of these countries, the power of the state ultimately subordinated the power of capital. By the way, in all four countries, this happened because the power of the state was ultimately like backed by the United States. And because these were the frontline states against communism and blah, blah, and so on. And so a power other than the capital of these countries dictated policy. It had an autonomy above and beyond the capital could not dictate policy to the states. And that's why you could get effective industrial policy in these countries. And you are not going to see that very easily in the US or for that matter in the UK.
Yes, I mean the push for reindustrialization, if you like, through Inflation Reduction Act, some kind of tariff there. I see it as mostly coming from the political class trying to assuage their voter base because they know, that there are issues with employment and quality of employment and so on and so forth. And then there is the other section of manufacturing interest versus the financial interest. So there is also sort of giving some protection to manufacturing base, which is a big base in so many ways, the Rust Belt and so on and so forth. I think we can shift to China now, and tell us a little bit about what kind of work you do with a platform like Friends of Socialist China was the project, and probably discuss like a couple of points. I'm not asking you to go through its history and so on and so forth, but probably because China went a different direction in this period that we are discussing, like starting with the 80s, 90s. And that's definitely not neoliberalism. It's a stupid analogy to do. So tell us a little bit about what kind of work you do on Friends with Socialist China and what China got right, sorry, in this period.
Sure. So first of all, let me say that Friends of Socialist China is actually run by two people who I know very well, or by a group of people, but particularly two people who are very central to it, Keith Bennett and Carlos Martinez, and they are good friends. And I'm on the board of Friends of Socialist China, but I don't primarily run it. I don't set its direction, although I generally agree with its direction. But I also run the International Manifesto Group. I'm the convener of the International Manifesto Group, and that what we think about China is actually in our manifesto. It's called Through Pluripolarity Towards Socialism, a manifesto, which basically says many of the things that I've been saying, but many others as well. And I've been saying many things that are not in the manifesto. But anyway, the general idea is that both Friends of Socialist China and the International Manifesto Group understands China to be, in some meaningful sense, a socialist country. Now, that doesn't mean that there are no criticisms that, I would not, for example, criticize the level of inequality in China. But having said that, I would also not do it in an unsympathetic way. I also understand that ruling circles in China understand that this is a problem, that they are doing many things. For example, the anti-corruption drive, for example, the poverty alleviation drive, for example, the expansion of the Chinese market drive, all of these things. They're doing a lot of things to try to overcome this issue, this problem. I think it's also the case that I would understand that the Chinese party state has always been a lot more, shall we say, careful and also a lot more willing to do trial and error. And there have been instances where they may have tried something and they say, okay, no, that's not the way to go, and this is the way to go, etc. Because there is no highway to socialism. You have to feel your way towards it and try to do that. So broadly speaking, I would say that I see China as a socialist country. That does not mean that there are no capitalists in China. That doesn't mean there are no big capitalists in China. There are many exceedingly big capitalists in China, and it does not mean that they are not politically influential. They are certainly members in many cases of the Communist Party and so on. But the thing that makes China socialist is that when push comes to shove, the state can call capital to account. It can say to Jack Ma, you can't do this, you can't have your IPO, etc. You must do this. So that's, to me, that's the main thing. And what China has got right, I think, ultimately, of course, is the political question. Just as I have a political definition of capitalism, capitalist country is a country in which capital holds the reins of political power. So socialist country is a country in which a force representing the interests of the people holds the reign of state power. In this case, it's the Chinese party state. And so I would say that most fundamentally, what China has got right is the fact that the Revolutionary Party retains power and retains broad and deep legitimacy, thanks to its conduct so far. Again, as I say, not to say that everything is perfect, but in the circumstances, this is pretty good result to get for such a large country. Which was, remember, at the end of, by certain measures anyway, we were just discussing the limitations of GDP statistics, but according to the measures that were available at that time, in the late 1940s, in 1949, India was still richer than China. So that's what we read anyway. So, that's a kind of a measure, benchmark to go with. And then since then, a lot of people think that China had this very bad period. Well, it depends on, there's a lot of people, both on the left and the right, draw very hard and fast divide between the pre-1978 era and the post-1978 era. So many on the left will say everything that happened before 78 was way better than what happened since, and since then China has simply given in to capitalism, etc. And many of the right would say that, everything that happened before 1978 was very bad, and the turn to reform was very good. China is essentially becoming another capitalist country, and that's very good, etc. But the reality is that there's actually a continuity between what happened between what happened before 1978 and what happened after. And there is a continuity of the revolution. There is a continuity of essentially running the economy in the broader interests of the people. The big change, I would say, that took place at that time is that it was simply impossible to keep control of a much larger country with a much larger young population, etc. It was much more difficult to run it as a command economy. And in many ways, the concession that was made was that, essentially we are going to allow a greater freedom of private enterprise in order, but while retaining control of what we used to call the commanding heights of the economy. And that is how China has progressed. Since China did also get another thing very correct, which is that you have to have an industrial policy. So while you may trade and you may export and you may import and you may have foreign direct investment, both domestic and foreign capital have to follow some kind of a broader national plan, which should be geared towards increasing the productive capacities and the technological capacities of the domestic economy. And this is what the Chinese state has managed to do, which is why it has used outsourcing to its credit. Because you see, when you have outsourcing rather than FDI, you can have greater control over what's happening, because you can essentially say to your own domestic enterprises, you can encourage them to and facilitate them to move up the value chain. Because they are independent producers. They are not essentially branch plants of some or the other big Western corporation. And so China has been able to do that in a number of different technological respects. So, I mean, these are all the things that China has broadly got right. And I would say that you saw how the Chinese party state is able to control the economy in the aftermath of 2008, where, of course, if you think about it, the whole world suffered a very short and sharp trade shock. And China would have suffered the most, because China was very deeply imbricated in these markets, in these Western markets, which suddenly collapsed. And the Chinese showed that they could turn this big economy around on a dime. They essentially said initially, we are going to invest, we are going to have a big investment boom. And they ran its course over the next 2 or 3 years. Then they brought that to a close. Then they went into a situation where they have allowed wages to rise. Today, in China, wages have risen sufficiently that the production of many things by world market standards is no longer acceptable. No longer cost efficient in China. So it is essentially shedding industry elsewhere, allowing it to go elsewhere, whether to Vietnam or to other parts of Asia and wherever have you. And then now, it would seem now, yes, there has also been a big property boom in China. There has been a big increase in real estate prices in China and so on. And people expect that, there's going to be like some kind of a big, property bust, just as you had in Japan in the late 80s and early 90s, and you had in 2008 in the United States. But I just don't think that's going to be the case, because China has a very different financial infrastructure, and it is already taking care to ensure that various types of lending that have been problematic are curbed, other types of lending are increased, and so on. So essentially, China is trying to reorient the economy in a different direction. It will manage, of course, there will be some kind of a reduction in the price of real estate, as there should be, because too many young people are going without being able to buy their homes and so on. You can't have that. So China will manage that, but increasingly China is also moving towards directing, having new rules for example, savings and investment sector, so that more and more of the savings of ordinary people are directed towards the favored industries, the high-tech industries, and so on, the industries which are national priorities. And I would say that we just have to wait and watch. I mean, I personally think all of these are good ideas. The West finds every possible opportunity to rain on China's parade, but so far China is not affected by that. China will continue, I think, to grow at a fairly good rate, if not the 10 and 12% rates that you had for a while there. But yeah, so I would say that and I think that the key here is that you have somebody, who is in charge. It's the party state is in charge and is willing to take responsibility. At the end of the day, in most of our Western countries, no single person is in charge, and different people are doing different things. And basically, the political powers are eager just to please big Western corporations whose interests are more and more antithetical to those of the economy and to those of working people. So the question only is, when will this contradiction come to mature? When will it break out into some kind of crisis? This is what we have to wait and see in the Western countries.
I think I wanted to ask you about socialism. I mean, as leftists, we spend a lot of time understanding, analyzing capitalism, but sometimes every now and then we also stop and think what the vision of socialism might be. Um, and I think there is a need to think about it in new innovative ways. There is a past that tells us something about collectivization of land and peasants' resistance to it. Um, uh, we know a lot about the importance of state ownership of activities that are rent yielding and so on and so forth. But we also understand now the importance of market in so many ways. I mean, once the market would be thought of as completely an evil, but now today a lot of people would consider that market, despite all the precarities and shocks, might also allow people to get jobs, sometimes desperate peasants to find the labor market and get wage. And when agriculture prices are depressed, that's a protection, and so on and so forth. Um, and you mentioned one aspect of the party being in command of its polity, but a lot of countries would people who think that in our part of the world there is the Communist Party doesn't have that kind of political power, and we might still think about socialism. So, as someone as a Marxist thinker, I consider you as one of our important thinkers. What's your take on socialism? This is an
Well,
area I am very confused always.
yeah, I mean, there's so many different questions that we should discuss. So first of all, of course, there's the whole issue of, what Marx said socialism would be, and, whether, and some conception of this is usually used as a stick with which to beat all actually existing socialisms, because these are not socialist countries, etc. But I would say that Marx was a very interesting, intelligent man, and it would not have been at all like him to imagine that a perfect socialism would be achieved overnight. No, the road to socialism is going to be long. Along that road, mistakes will be made. But at the same time, it's a road worth embarking on. There is, in fact, no other way. If you agree with what I said earlier, that capitalism is past its sell-by date, then we are going to, I mean, In fact, if we don't embark on the road to socialism, we will be, sometime soon, we will be ending up having to pick up the pieces of a self-destructed capitalism rather than building a better life for ourselves. So let's not even let that happen. I think so that's the first thing I want to say. Second thing I want to say is that socialism also has played a very important role in the larger geopolitical economy of the capitalist world in the following sense. In every country so far where socialism has been attempted, it has been as much about resisting capitalism as it has been about resisting imperialism.
Mm-hmm.
This is very, very important. So that both the Soviet Union and China and many other countries that have had to develop. I mean, the Soviet Union was the most developed of all the countries that have become socialist, but even it was the victim of both capitalism and imperialism. And it had to develop, perhaps not so much from a point set back by imperialism, which was relatively, it was there, but not so deep as in China or India for that matter, but nevertheless. But it certainly had to develop in the teeth of imperialist resistance. And so that was, and it had to develop without having the luxury of access to colonies. You know, if you think about, and this is a very important point, and it's a most fundamental point that ordinary people don't think about. You know, when the West developed, we said the West is developed, so we should develop, fine. But when the West developed, a very large part of the rest of the world paid the price of that development, generated the resources that led to that development. In the Soviet Union, as well as in China, if you were going to create a transition from a predominantly agrarian to an increasingly industrialized society, there was no other way than to transfer resources from the existing productive sector, namely agriculture, to the new productive sector you are trying to create, namely industry. Without that transfer of resources, which takes many forms, you have to transfer surpluses, you have to transfer capital, you have to transfer labor, you have to transfer food. You know, your native agriculture has to be capable of producing more food so that people who are not primarily engaged in producing food can also eat. You know, industrial workers can eat, etc. All these things have to happen before you can manage the transition from agriculture to industry. And all of this has to happen without your being able to access some captive population whose consumption you can squeeze, whose production you can extract, etc. And so in a certain sense, the collectivization of land was a decision that, you know, I don't want to go, you know, but some version, whether it was through collectivization of land or through some other means, but some version of essentially creating a pipeline of transferring resources from agriculture to industry had to be devised in both countries, China, Russia. I'm confining our discussion to that, to these two countries. So in that sense, I think that, you know, to understand socialism, you know, how do you build socialism without imperialism? This has to be an important question that everybody must think about. If you are not going to rely on being able to loot some other people, you've got to think about how you are yourself on your own steam going to create and maintain a reasonably successful, technologically sophisticated, productive enterprise. Of course, there were other things. I mean, think about it this way. When China and Russia became, you know, had their revolutions, they simply did not have the technological manpower to create industries. They had to generate this manpower on their own, again, on their own steam, and so on. And that's what had to happen. So again, if you want to create the same kind of transformation in India or some other developing countries, South Africa, Brazil, you have to invest in that sort of skills and manpower, human power, and so on. So this imperialism issue, you know, if the whole world is the capitalist world has been an imperialist world, then the question of socialism has to involve the question of imperialism. So that's the second thing I want to say about socialism, and the rest is actually, to me, relatively easy. You see, the reason why in the manifesto that we created, we talk about pluripolarity and we say we are going to go through pluripolarity towards socialism, is that socialism is not going to arrive in the world in one loud thunderclap. Every country, depending on the political situation there, depending on the balance of social forces, depending on popular energies and how they are, the quality and quantity of popular energies and so on, each country will embark on some sort of road to socialism on its own. It's not going to have, so it'll be a multi-speed transition. And therefore the plurality of social forms. But as capitalism becomes less and less able to organize production in a way that satisfies the needs of the majority of the population, even in the imperialist countries, let alone in the countries outside that, some kind of socialism has to be put on the agenda. And then, yes, I mean, I would say that essentially, so long as you are going in a direction that seeks to increase and augment productive capacities and distribute the fruits of production in a relatively egalitarian way, with all exceptions to that egalitarianism made primarily in order to develop the forces of production, develop productive capacities, I would say every country will find its own way of doing it. And as I said, there will also be lots of problems along the way, but for humankind as a whole, this has to be the broad parameters of doing so. And so that's what I would say about socialism. But if I've forgotten some important element, please prompt me again.
No, this is not a comprehensive project. It's always very helpful to think aloud and listen to people who has thought about it. I'm very mindful of your time. I am allowing to let you go with this one final question, if your time permits.
Sure.
Um, a lot of people, outside India in particular, because in India people have a fair sense of proximity to what Hindu nationalism is, and they have responded to it. But a lot of people globally seem to not really understand the implication of the recent election, where the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, lost its single party majority from a huge margin and now is forced into a coalition government. My sense is that one segment of that is the misunderstanding of the tremendous rupture in India because of fascism and Hindu nationalism. I mean, if it was an ordinary election, then one could argue that, okay, there is nothing much to celebrate because these people were in power, they are still in power. You told me you have been thinking a little bit about fascism and how Modi has perfected it. So if you can just wrap up our discussion by discussing what your thoughts are about Hindu nationalism.
Sure. So first of all, of course, some of at least your listeners will know and our listeners will know that in India, fascism has very deep roots. That is to say, there has been in existence an organized fascist force going back to the 1920s when the RSS came into existence. It was clearly overtly inspired by Mussolini and later Hitler, and it has continued in existence since. It was banned for a time after the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi, which was at the hands of a Hindu nationalist that had connections with this organization. But beyond that, it has been allowed to exist and has continued to exist. And then you see, I've talked about how fascism, this party first got an opportunity to come to power with a government under its leadership, and that was between 1998 and 2004, when we had a BJP. So the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, is the party that is connected to the Sangh Parivar, the RSS, and is essentially the fascist party of the country. They came to power, but they could not come to power without having to enter into coalition with a lot of other regional parties. And certainly when we look at the Modi decade, the last decade, we can see that at that time, while of course there were many things wrong with that government, and there were also attempts back then to try to corrupt the institutions of state and culture and so on, society. Nevertheless, the Vajpayee government was not able to go as far as Modi because its hands were tied by the requirements of what Vajpayee used to call coalition dharma. That is to say, he had to respect some of the wishes of the coalition government, of the coalition partners. So, and that also, but at the same time, it was quite harmful. It was quite authoritarian. Remember that under the watch of the Vajpayee government, we had the Gujarat genocide of Muslims. We had, and of course, the Vajpayee government itself had come as far as it had under the momentum of extremely violent fascistic Hindutva mobilizations involving, for instance, the destruction of the Babri Mosque and many other such, attacks on various tribal groups, on Christian groups, on Muslims across the country. So it was already, I would say that 1992, when the Babri Masjid was destroyed, was when India crossed a Rubicon of a sort. But even with these violent mobilizations, the Hindutva forces found that they could not really break the glass ceiling, which kept them below about 25% of the vote, in 1998, 1999. And of course, in 2004, they, after a full term in government, they went confidently to the electorate wanting to have a essentially a second term, and they were soundly defeated. And we then had the UPA decade, 2 terms of a Congress-led government, which also undertook some very progressive policies, the National Rural Employment Generation Scheme being the topmost of them, but there were many others as well. And then it in turn was defeated. Now, this moment when it was defeated and the Modi government came to power is, to me, the most interesting, and why I call the Modi government as the perfection of fascism. Because you see, during this time, as you know, in India, certainly since the 1980s, since the 1970s and 80s, but certainly since the 1990s, we have seen that India has implemented neoliberal policies. And of course, these neoliberal policies, like elsewhere, of course, they were not as unbridled, but nevertheless, they were neoliberal, where privatizations took place, contracting out took place, labor laws were reformed, agricultural laws were reformed, the whole shebang. So as more and more neoliberal policies were implemented, like everywhere else, you had the rise of corporate power. And by the end of the first decade of the 21st century, this power was now quite big. We had Reliance, we had the Ambanis, we didn't have Adani back then, which is another story altogether. But we had really big corporate houses. And you see, one of the things that happens when you have big corporations is that, for all the talk of free markets and competition, they actually become reliant, particularly in countries like India, on government contracts and government largesse and government policies of a certain agreeable sort and subsidies and what have you. And because of this reliance, essentially the Congress government, which at the end of the day, you have to realize that the Congress government was elected on the strength of the votes of the relatively poorer sections of Indian society. And so the contradiction between retaining their electoral base among these poorer people and then serving the interests of these big, rich corporations essentially exploded into a crisis of corruption. You had the Commonwealth Games corruption, the 2G scam, the coal scam, etc. And then to top it all, you had that big revelation about all the nationalized banks that had all these loans that they had given that were essentially to big corporations, which were never going to be paid back. So all of these, so essentially there was a big explosion of corruption issues. There was also the Anna Hazare anti-corruption movement, Arvind Kejriwal's Aam Aadmi Party, and generally speaking, the corporate capitalist class at this point began to engage in a discourse of policy paralysis. The Congress government is no longer able to serve their interests. It is paralyzed in terms of policy. We need an alternative, and it was the corporate capitalist class, India Inc., as I like to call it, that essentially foisted upon the BJP, Narendra Modi. Because remember, at that time, there were all these discussions in the party about who should succeed Vajpayee, who was aging quite manifestly. And generally speaking, the party was leaning towards Advani. Advani was also no spring chicken, but at least he was younger than Advani. And maybe after a term, there would be some other person who would show up and so on. But that was the general inclination. But essentially, Modi was foisted onto the BJP by the India Inc. And the reason why it did that, why Indian corporates did that, is because they had seen for the previous decade in Gujarat where Narendra Modi had been chief minister, that Narendra Modi had shown them that he could combine, number one, doing whatever the corporate capitalist classes wanted. Number two, winning elections. If somebody could do these two things, nothing could be better, right? So they essentially wanted him to repeat at the all India level what he had done at the Gujarat level. And they gave him all the money. I mean, they gave him more money than, Croesus had, some of the richest people in the world had. The Indian elections have since then been surpassing American levels of election expenditure. And it was this money power that allowed Modi to win office in the first place. And I would argue that it is quite possible that he would have not had a second term had it not been for the disunited opposition, the electoral bonds, and Balakot. These three things combined to give him a second term. But I would say that the very policies that so that's why I say this is fascism perfected, because essentially what I'm saying is that if you look at, and I have a paper which should be out this year, which will show this, if you look at Hitler's relationship with the corporate capitalist class and Modi's relationship with India Inc., the parallels are frightening. Okay. And this is exactly what you have, essentially what the big corporates want, because you have increasingly a monopoly capitalism whose interests are antithetical to that of the most ordinary people. So you have to find a way in an era of mass politics, of essentially managing mass politics, which means winning elections in our time, while at the same time doing what the corporates want them to do. And Modi has essentially done that. The trouble is that, Hitler's regime ended in a war. Yeah. We don't know whether there is going to be a war. And how would fascisms end if there is no war? So I would say that, of course, it has not ended. Fascism has not ended. Modi has won a second term, even if it is in coalition. The RSS and BJP have not ceased to exist. A very large number of well-to-do Indians have not ceased supporting them. So all of these things remain true, but Modi has certainly been cut down to size for the simple reason that, as I like to say, you cannot impose the kind of economic pain that Modi has imposed on ordinary Indians without incurring an electoral cost. It would have come in 2019. It has finally come in 2024. So this is what we have seen today. As I say, Modi will still try to do whatever is possible. And unless the only way we can get rid of fascism is if we get rid of capitalism, because as long as there is a powerful force which is able essentially to finance this kind of venture, which we have seen with Modi, we will not be rid of it. You have to have a very different kind of society in which there is no single force whose interest is so opposed to that of the rest of society that it is able and willing to do what has happened to India in the last decade. I hope that, the source of hope I have is that Congress seems to be beginning to realize that at least you cannot endorse the power of really big capital. You have to fight the Adanis and the Ambanis. Good. Now let's see if they can translate. And I was also happy that they seem to have realized that in order to be a political force of any significance, you have to relate to the people. You have to create an organizational structure, the Bharat Jodo Yatra, etc. These were good ventures. But the question now is, can Congress keep it up? Both the left-wing turn in economic policy, because there were some many good elements in Congress's manifesto, but there need to be more. That ideological direction needs to be sustained, and the organizational rejuvenation of Congress needs to be sustained if Hindutva is to be, or any other force, by the way. I'm not stuck to Congress, but if Congress is willing to do it, I'm not going to say, well, just because I don't like Congress or whatever. I mean, I don't dislike Congress. I just feel that Congress has been pursuing the wrong path, neoliberal path, for too long. But if it can turn around today, I would say that things are possible. But if it cannot, we are going to see, there is no way we are going to escape the return, if not of Modi, he's 73 now, then of some other character of this sort, who will take India further down that house of horrors that we have been in for so long, for the last decade. Yeah. And India was no pretty sight even before this
Mhm.
this decade of horrors. Yeah.
Apart from the defeat of the BJP at some of the heartlands where these Hindu nationalist movements were planted, including Ayodhya in the seat of Faizabad, the BJP was
Yes.
defeated, and
That was
other,
especially delicious.
yeah.
Yes.
Also,
That
the
not
they've
only
sub.
they lost Ayodhya, they lost this Faizabad seat, but Modi himself was his majority went down from like
Yeah,
4.79% to like 1.5%. Sorry,
yeah,
what
he
4.79 lakhs to 1.5 lakhs. So
1.34. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it's
Al-
ridiculous.
Also, a
That's
Dalit
ridiculous.
candidate from the Samajwadi Party. Samajwadi Party would be translated to Socialist Party. A Dalit candidate won in the
In
heartland of
Ayodhya.
this temple movement.
Exactly.
But apart from that, the other element that I recognize, which I don't think a lot of people have been talking about in mainstream media, is what you said. In Europe, for instance, the response from the mainstream centrist party or center left party to the rise of the far right has been to allow itself to shift towards the right and become a centrist party. In the case of India, at least I have seen that the center left party has shifted it a little bit further to the left. Uh,
Well, okay, hang on. I mean, one correction. I agree with you. That is what is happening now. But let's not forget that Congress also moved in the neoliberal direction.
it
You
began, I
know,
mean, it was at the center of the
well,
neoliberal.
no. Listen, when you got neoliberalism, both beginning Janata government essentially was liberalizing, then Mrs. Gandhi liberalized, then the Rao government liberalized, and the Vajpayee government continued, and the UPA also. UPA only slapped on a few layers of welfareism on top of a broad neoliberal approach. So that's why this ideological turn of Congress today, which I mean, elements of it were there in UPA and good for them, but it has to deepen a lot more. They have to actually abandon neoliberalism, which means, if you go back to our earlier part of our conversation, it means understanding that you have to bring capital under your control, not be under the control of capital. And that requires a considerable amount of state capacity and political capacity. And it's an open question whether Congress can do that. It's a big, remember, the only countries in the world where this has happened is countries where the power, state power is actually held by another country, namely the United States, like Japan or whatever. Or in the case of China or Russia, where you've had revolutions. So I would say I'd rather have a revolution than have the United States somehow treat us as a frontline state against
Mhm.
China and put India, and quite frankly, it will never be repeated in the same way. I mean, if India does, Mr. Modi been exchanging messages with the president of Taiwan, which is going to, of course, be a red flag to China, which has already been so. So, it looks as though Mr. Modi will, who knows, create some kind of foreign policy issue and so on. But India should not be, and Modi would love nothing more than to line India up alongside the US. The problem for him is that at the moment he can't easily do that because it would lose the cheap oil imports from Russia, which is keeping inflation within some control. Although already inflation is too high, even with those cheap imports, God knows what he will have on his hands if we don't have Russian cheap oil. And of course, his capitalist cronies are benefiting also from buying cheap Russian oil and selling it onward to other countries, including
Exporting.
Europe. Yeah, exactly. So all of these things are complicated, but I would say that until this past decade, when I would say that Congress, two or three things happened. Number one, Congress got a drubbing. Number two, Congress faced Modi and his authoritarianism, which is of a scale never before known, so that it was completely marginalized even in parliament. We have had no leader of the opposition for 2 full terms of parliament. If Rahul Gandhi accepts this position, he will be the first leader of the opposition for a decade. So when you do things like that, parties do suffer. So they've got that, and I think there may be the beginnings of an understanding that the Modis, the Adanis, and the Ambanis of this world will only support the BJP. If they want to be a political force, they will have to abandon their desire to be the party of choice of Indian corporate elites and be the party of ordinary people, which need not preclude being the party of small and medium capital. No problem with that. Do it. Because right now, small and medium capital is also hurting under a regime whose one point economic program is to do what really big corporates want, and the rest of the country can go to hell as far as Mr. Modi is concerned.
Yeah, that was precisely the kind of things I had in mind. I mean, it's very few countries you find the leader of a major party openly calling names to its biggest corporations. I mean, it's
Yes.
we have to give credit for that, because that
Yes.
keeps the legitimacy of struggle against corporate capitalism. Um, but Professor Desai, this was such a wonderful discussion, and you were very, very generous with your time and everything else. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that other our listeners enjoy it just as much. Thank you.
All
Hi,
right.
my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.